Well, good evening. I think we probably better get started. I'm Dick Rieselbach, and I'm board chair of our Capital Lakes Successful Aging Project. And our other Capital Lakes board members, Jane Wojcik and Marge Engelman and Jay Levy, join me in being delighted that we can initiate this first Professor James Crow Memorial Lecture. And you're going to be hearing a lot about Professor Crow in a few minutes from Dr. Maki, so I will not elaborate there. I will spend just 1 minute in terms of talking about Dr. Maki. The handout that we gave you results in an abbreviation of my comments, but I should mention that Dr. Maki is a really internationally renowned infectious disease expert who is really, has been for years and years, one of our most outstanding, if not the outstanding, faculty member at the UW Medical School at University Hospitals, and where it turns out that Dr. Maki and Dr. Crow knew each other extremely well. And Dr. Maki, in terms of successful aging, is another good example. At age 78, he still attends frequently on our intensive care unit and is the infectious disease expert for the hospital and works every weekend. So that we look forward to a great talk from Dr. Maki.
Thank you very much, Dick. It's a great honor to come to Capital Lakes tonight to give the first James Crow Memorial Lecture. Jim Crow lived his last 10 or 12 years of his life here at Capital Lakes and died in 2012. Jim Crow was a truly remarkable man. He was well known for more than half a century as a distinguished professor of genetics at the University of Wisconsin. He joined the faculty in 1948, and he served on the faculty for nearly 60 years. He was chair of the Department of Medical Genetics for almost 15 years in aggregate, and served for 3 years as acting dean of the UW Medical School. But he was really known internationally for his research. He was one of the pioneers of population genetics, which is a field of inquiry that bridges old classic Mendelian genetics with modern-day DNA genetics, and is a mathematically and statistically highly technical field, but has had a huge impact in our understanding of evolution literally at the molecular level. He actually published over 250 papers in his lifetime. And what's most striking to me about Dr. Crow is that he published 20 papers in the last 10 years of his life, and he died at age 95. Very few academicians are productive after the age of 65 or 70, and he was active literally up to the day he died. I did a Science Citation Index search of the citations of his paper. If you're a distinguished scientist, people cite your papers in their papers. You have an impact on the field. The apogee of his citations, the largest number, occurred 3 years after he died. 500 people cited his research in 2015. That's quite remarkable. He was not only a giant in population genetics, but was also an international authority in chemical and radiation mutagenesis, and an international authority on the impact of low-level radiation on human health. His research and his influence was very significant in the abolition of nuclear testing above ground 40 years ago. He also became an expert on the forensic applications of DNA testing and was truly probably one of the most distinguished historians of modern genetics. What was most remarkable about Professor Crow, beyond his research, was his public service. He served 7 committees on the National Academy of Sciences. To serve 1 or 2 in a professional lifetime is extraordinary. If you're even elected to the Academy of Sciences, that is an extraordinary achievement. He served on 7 committees. He chaired 5. He was an advisor to the director of the NIH and served on 3 NIH study sections, of which he chaired 2 of them. He served on the first commission on DNA testing of the National Institute of Justice, and he was chair. He served on the Health and Advisory Committee of the Department of Energy. He was one of the editors of genetics for many years and was an advisor to the NCAACP. But many people knew him best as a beloved and distinguished activist citizen of Madison for 64 years. He was a violist in the Madison Symphony Orchestra for almost 35 years and was president. And he was president of the Madison Civic Music Association. He was truly a polymath in many respects. With that kind of a career, he received virtually every honor that a biologic academician might aspire to. He was a UW Bascom professor and was a distinguished research professor at the university near the end of his career. He was a longtime member of the National Academy of Sciences for over 40 years. He was a member of the National Institute of Medicine. Very few scientists are both members of the National Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. He was a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophic Society. To be members of all 4 of these is truly extraordinary. He was a foreign member of the Royal Society of Medicine in the UK and of the Japanese Academy of Sciences, and received honorary doctorates from the University of Chicago and the University of Edinburgh. I knew Dr. Crow. I didn't know him well, but I knew him well enough that I spoke here 12 years ago to give a lecture. Dr. Crow was the person who invited me. It's very humbling to be able to give this lecture in his memory. He was one of the great faculty members of the UW-Madison and a great international scientist and a wonderful human being. Tonight, I'd like to talk about a very significant problem that has not received nearly the attention that it deserves because of the threat it poses to global health, namely the impact of global warming. And since I'm a specialist on infectious diseases, it'll be heavily focused towards infectious diseases. But near the end, I'm going to review in some detail the potential impact of global warming in very diverse areas of our life and society on this earth. I have no conflicts of interest to report, and I'm going to try and cover 4 areas. I'm going to talk about what are emerging infectious diseases and what are the major emerging infectious diseases of the early 21st century. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about exactly why have these emerging infectious diseases emerged. And we'll talk a lot about the impact of global warming because it's played a very central role on the emergence of many of these infectious diseases. And we'll talk at the end about preparing for emerging infectious diseases at the global, the national, the state, and local levels. So what are emerging infectious diseases? This is a famous woodcut from the Middle Ages. It depicts the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse of Revelation: war, death, famine, and pestilence, contagious, epidemic, infectious diseases. The most common cause of death until 100 years ago was an infectious disease. This is the most famous biologic scientist of all time. Anybody know who this is? It's the great Louis Pasteur. Pasteur lived in the mid-19th century and was not only a biologist, but he was a chemist. And the magnitude of his achievements scientifically were truly epical. They were extraordinary. He hypothesized and proved the germ theory of infectious disease, that microorganisms that you could see in a microscope were the cause of a wide variety of human diseases, such as pneumonia, sepsis, urinary tract infection, skin and soft tissue infections, plague, anthrax, tuberculosis. And he not only was the father of infectious diseases, he developed the first targeted vaccine. Before any infectious microorganism was really characterized, he hypothesized that rabies was caused by microorganism, and maybe you could somehow attenuate the rabies organism and allow it to be used as a vaccine to enhance natural immunity. And he developed the first vaccine, rabies vaccine, that saved the life of a young boy who had been bitten by a rabid wolf and otherwise was doomed to die of rabies. Pasteur died before the end of the 19th century. If you are alive today and he saw all of the vaccines that have been developed, and the list grows every year, or all of the antibiotics and antifungals and antivirals that have been developed really in the lifetime of all of us here today, he would be simply astonished. We can take great pride in the achievements of modern science and medicine in understanding the basis of disease, which is the basis for finding ways to prevent and treat disease. By 1970, one of our most esteemed Surgeon Generals, William Stewart, who commissioned the first Surgeon General's report on smoking, was quoted as asserting the U.S. was ready to close the book on infectious diseases as a health threat. He was feeling very heady about the advances in new antibiotics and immunization. But infections didn't go away like he and a lot of people thought they would. They remained, and they became an ever more complex and formidable challenge. By the late 20th century, more people were still dying due to infectious disease around the world every day than died due to heart disease or cancer combined. When I entered this field, graduating from medical school in '67, making the decision in 1971 that I was going to pursue infectious diseases, a lot of people felt that all of the microorganisms that cause human infection had been identified. The field was stagnating. There were no new diseases to find or treat. We just needed more better vaccines, some better antivirals. And then the world changed. In 1977, a whole bunch of Legionnaires went to a convention in Philadelphia. And about the time they were going home, many of them came down with pneumonia. This is an x-ray of a patient with pneumonia. The CDC sent a team in to find out why hundreds of Legionnaires were developing severe pneumonia. And they spent a couple of $1 million in 3 or 4 weeks of intensive study, and they could not find the cause of pneumonia. And this was not a trivial pneumonia, because 15% of these Legionnaires died of their pneumonia. And only 6 months later, why we have a CDC, why we make that investment, a researcher working at the CDC on Christmas Eve of that year saw something on a special stain in the tissues of patients who died of Legionnaire's disease. It looked like an unusual bacterium. They developed a very rich medium, and pretty soon they could culture it. They could quickly characterize it. They could sequence the genome of the organism, and it was called the Legionella bacillus. and Legionella pneumophila, an entirely new disease. It was very quickly clear this was all around us. Most of us have been exposed to this when we shower every morning. It's in the Madison water supply. And it's an important cause of pneumonia where people don't find the cause. But it's treatable with certain antibiotics. And I may tell you how sobering that was to the infectious disease and microbiology community. An entirely new disease, and it was right under our noses. Within several years, healthy young women were coming into emergency departments in shock. There's a 15-year-old woman in profound shock at university hospitals, and she is red as a lobster. What she had was toxic shock syndrome, an old pathogen, a well-known human pathogen, Staph aureus, but a new toxin, a toxin-producing Staph aureus that caused this devastating disease that was killing 15 or 20% of these young women. Once we knew what the cause was, we found a way to treat it. Nobody should die of staphylococcal toxic shock syndrome. It is related to the use of hyperabsorbent tampons that allowed the toxin to be absorbed in the body of these women during their menstrual cycles. Only 3 years later, young gay men and intravenous drug users were coming down with strange opportunistic infections with germs that don't normally infect healthy people. And when they studied the immunity of these young people, their cellular immunity was gone. It had been devastated. They had acquired an immune deficiency, the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS. It was discovered in 1981. A tribute to good science, the cause was identified within 3 years, treatment was identified within 2 more years, and all this is a global epidemic. Nobody needs to die of AIDS any longer because if you take your treatment, you can live literally a normal lifespan. This was a really important opportunistic pathogen, emerging infectious disease. By about 2000, new infectious diseases were being identified by sophisticated molecular methods, and the National Institute of Medicine commissioned a blue ribbon panel to examine the question of emerging infections to make recommendations to the government on targeting resources to be ready to control these new infectious diseases. And they defined an emerging infectious disease as an entirely new disease such as Legionnaire's disease or Lyme disease or toxic shock syndrome or the reemergence of an infection that had been controlled, such as diphtheria on a massive scale or antibiotic resistance on a major scale. We could talk all day about antibiotic resistance. That's a topic for another day. Let's talk about emerging infectious diseases of the early 21st century. About 10 years ago, I wrote an editorial on this for the Mayo Clinic Proceedings. I've updated this list that I put together in the editorial. If we look at these, Legionella pneumonia, Clostridium difficile antibiotic-associated colitis, toxic shock syndrome, Campylobacter infection that causes peptic ulcers, HIV and AIDS, Norwalk virus, norovirus that causes severe diarrhea and vomiting in 35 million Americans every winter, Lyme disease, Bartonella infection, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and prion diseases, hepatitis C, Ehrlichia and Anaplasma tick-borne diseases, the return of measles and pertussis and diphtheria and cholera, cryptosporidiosis, and I can go down, and the list continues to grow every year. Why have these diseases emerged? That's really a fascinating question and fundamental to controlling them. Well, there are many reasons. Let's drill down and look at some of them. We've known for over 100 years that whenever you have war, you have massive disruption of society due to flooding, tremendous weather extremes, political upheaval, large numbers of refugees. You have epidemic disease, diarrheal disease, typhoid, measles, TB that you would not normally see. In sub-Saharan Africa, where there are millions of displaced individuals in Ethiopia and Somalia, hundreds of thousands of children are dying of diarrheal illness every year. They die of meningitis and tuberculosis. Changes in healthcare have had a profound impact on emerging infectious diseases. When I graduated from medical school, there were no implanted medical devices. They were experimenting on implanted joints and prosthetic heart valves. We had no transplantation, and chemotherapy was in its very early infancy. Today, if you get critically ill, you'll end up in an ICU. You may be on a ventilator with a tube in your trachea, on a breathing machine, and you'll have intravenous catheters to give you fluids and drugs, and you may have a urinary catheter drain your urine. All of these put you at risk of hospital-acquired infection. I spent my research lifetime of the last 45 years studying how to prevent healthcare-associated infections. One of the most important advances in modern healthcare in the last 100 years has been implanted medical devices. This is the bionic man or woman. It could be a pacemaker, an artificial hip, an artificial knee, mechanical devices to help joints heal. We can have artificial heart valves. We can have shunts that drain fluid from the brain in children who have congenital hydrocephalus. There's at least 50 different types of implanted medical devices that have greatly improved the quality of life. I personally have 5. I have 2 prosthetic hips. I have a Carpentier ring in my heart to stabilize a valve that had ruptured. And I have 2 artificial lenses. And I'm very grateful I have all of them. They've greatly improved the quality of my life. The biggest risk with all of these is infection. And the risk of infection with implanted medical devices used to be very high. It's now very low. As we've learned why these infections occur, we know the precautions that need to be taken to reduce risk. Much of my research has been on treating the surface of these devices to make them intrinsically resistant to infection, and that's been very successful. Changes in food production. At the time most of us were growing up, 60, 70 years ago, your meat was prepared from animals that lived in a pastoral setting on little farms. And today, all of the food that we eat is industrially produced. There are perhaps 250,000 chickens in this picture. 50,000 cows may go to slaughter on a given day. And food is prepared on an industrial scale. So that if something goes wrong with the process, hundreds of thousands or millions of people can be exposed to a foodborne illness. And although the companies do a very good job, our food is pretty darn safe, national epidemics are now common. Every year there are probably 6 outbreaks of disease. Fortunately, the CDC has got a very good foodborne surveillance system. They pick it up early, they nip it in the bud, and it rarely becomes big. But these are truly emerging infectious diseases, such as Salmonella, Campylobacter, Shiga toxin, E. coli, or Listeria. Changes in human behavior have had a profound impact. When I graduated from medical school, syphilis was so rare that a lot of people could practice a lifetime and never see a case. In the 1960s, the world changed. There was a sexual revolution. What was wrong with having sex before marriage? What was wrong with having multiple sexual partners? And it translated predictably to a massive pandemic of sexually acquired infections. And part of this pandemic was identifying many new sexually transmitted diseases. There are only 5 when I graduated from medical school, no. Now there's over 30 sexually transmitted diseases. And some of the most important that were identified since I left medical school are herpes, HIV, genital warts, and genital wart-related cancer in women. Do you realize that 1 billion people fly internationally every year? 1 billion passenger flights. As a consequence, many diseases that are unique to certain areas of the world can be spread anywhere. And you can be sitting next to somebody on an international flight and pick up Ebola or multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Microorganisms actually adopt and become more virulent. And we have seen that with flu strains that have become super virulent, very resistant strains of the staph, MRSA, or toxic shock, toxigenic staph, or toxigenic group A strep, or C. difficile-associated diarrhea. These are organisms that have adapted. We don't exactly know why they adapted, but they did it, and they cause a lot of serious human disease. Changes in the public health infrastructure are very important. Far too few people appreciate the thin veneer of protection we have against devastating infectious diseases, the impact of vaccines, and the investment we make in public health at the national, at the state, and the local levels. We actually spend half the number of dollars adjusted for inflation now for public health than we did 30 years ago. And so the fact that the public health community is able to provide the high level of protection they do is truly a tribute. Let me show you what happens when public health fails. Many of you may remember Glasnost and Gorbachev in the late 1980s. The Soviet Union was going to adopt a democratic government. They were going to try to stop managing their economy, have a free enterprise system. Well, it was a good idea, except the communists in the government acquired all the businesses, and overnight there were a lot of billionaire oligarchs in the Soviet Union, and their economy imploded. People stopped paying taxes. They couldn't pay pensions to retired people. They stopped immunizing children. Within 3 years of stopping immunizing children, they went from about 50 to 100 cases of diphtheria a year to 50,000 cases. And hundreds and thousands of children developed diphtheria and died. On our own shores, there's been a move to resist vaccines. Somehow, vaccines are bad. And what's so terribly frustrating is highly educated individuals have somehow concluded vaccines may cause autism or pose a threat to their children. When I graduated from medical school, there were 5 million cases of measles in the United States that year. 1 out of every 1,000 of those kids, that's 5,000, developed severe encephalitis. Most of those kids either died or they ended up in an institution, severely impaired. We eliminated measles. Measles is coming back. It's coming back on a significant scale because of the resistance to let your children be immunized. And we urgently need better ways to convince people that vaccines provide protection for everybody. And if you don't immunize your children, you're putting your children's friends and your neighbors' children at risk. Changes in the environment. In Africa, in my lifetime, Africa went from being a very urban society of small pastoral villages, very few big cities, to a very urban society. 50 to 75% of all Africans now live in huge cities under very crowded conditions. And this has tremendously accelerated the transmission of AIDS, Lassa virus, Ebola virus. Why we're having more and more outbreaks of Ebola in Africa now. In the United States, we're going in the opposite direction. People want to get out of the city. We want to live in a pastoral, natural setting out in the country. But if you do that, you're going to be living near animals, wild animals, lots of insects, and you're going to put yourself at much higher risk of vector-borne diseases. What you're looking at is the extraordinary, huge Amazon rainforest. Every week, an area the size of Rhode Island is burned down and cleared off. And that is translating to an increase in malaria, dengue, and vector-borne diseases, and is contributing to global warming with a huge amount of greenhouse gases that are produced. When we talk about global warming, we have good data on global temperatures going back almost 200 years. Beginning about 1940, mean temperatures around the world started to rise. This is the area when we started to have a lot of industrialization, particularly for World War II. And since 1980, it's taken off like a shot. The last 5 years have been the warmest years on record that we have. And we can speculate going back, much further back, by sophisticated studies done in glaciers, and this is probably the warmest that we've had for thousands of years. Now, a lot of people say, what's the big deal? If we look at geographic time, we've had periods in the world where we've had a lot of warming, it's been very warm, other periods where we have ice ages. This is just very natural. This is sort of the flux of climate around the world. However, if you look at the trend of the temperature, it directly parallels CO2 concentrations. And the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are higher than they've been in probably 100 million years. And these CO2 and greenhouse gases are what create global warming. The sun, the energy, does not get reflected back into space, but is contained on the Earth, and the mean temperature continues to rise. The argument has been, is global warming due to human activity, or is it just simply a natural phenomenon? I think the direct parallel with CO2 concentrations, and we now know that the major source of CO2 production is by human activities, particularly burning of fossil fuels. Let me take an important emerging infectious disease. All of the tick-borne diseases, all of these tick-borne diseases, with the exception of Rocky Mountain spotted fever and tularemia, have been identified and characterized only in the last 35 years. They were not known before 35 years ago. And we now know Lyme disease and anaplasmosis and ehrlichiosis are big deals. There are hundreds of thousands of cases every year, and people can get very, very sick and even die. These ticks are very small, and they cause a lot of disease. So the question is, are tick-borne diseases really on the rise? If so, why? Well, if we look at Wisconsin, one of the reasons we all love to live in Wisconsin, at least it is for me, is not only is there a great quality of life, but we have a terrific public health system. The public health system at the state level and the local levels is as good as there is in the country. The only other state that's close to us is Minnesota. And CDC cherishes the superb public health that Wisconsin has maintained for the past 50 to 75 years. And we've got very good data on rates of infection. And Wisconsin data would say Lyme disease is clearly in the upsurge. So is Anaplasma and ehrlichiosis. And so is babesiosis. National data shows the same thing. If we look at a very rare disease that's easy to diagnose, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, a devastating disease, this has increased very substantially in my life. It was so rare when I was a medical student in house officer, I never saw a case. Now it's becoming more and more common. CDC published just in the last year that tick-borne diseases are clearly on the increase in the United States. The most important tick-borne disease, they have all the same tick-borne diseases in Europe and Asia, Soviet Union, that we have. Plus, they have a very serious tick-borne disease called tick-borne encephalitis. And people can get very sick and be severely, permanently impaired neurocognitively. And it occurs in a belt all the way from Asia across the Soviet Union into Europe. It's very clear that tick-borne encephalitis is also clearly on the increase. Several years ago, the National Academy of Sciences commissioned a blue ribbon panel to look at tick-borne diseases, and their conclusion was very clearly tick-borne diseases are unequivocally on the very substantial increase. If we look at malaria, malaria is also on the increase, but what's even more concerning, malaria used to be a disease that was within 10 degrees of the equator. With global warming, we're now seeing malaria moving north and south. And it's projected by 2020, malaria will be endemic in most of Europe and in the southern part of the United States. That's pretty sobering. Global warming will bring us to the age of the insect. These are all pathogenic insect species that can cause devastating human disease. The father of internal medicine, William Osler, who lived 100 years ago, made the assertion that humanity has but three great enemies: infection, famine, and war. Of these, the most terrible is infection. Well, I'm going to postulate tonight that we have something worse than infection, that encompasses infection, and that's global warming. Global warming, I think, is rapidly becoming the 800-pound gorilla that poses the greatest threat to human health. What are the consequences of global warming if it's not curtailed? If it's due to human activity and we do nothing, where will we be in 25, 50, and certainly 75 years? What will our grandchildren and our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, be facing? Well, first of all, we're already seeing it. There will be a tremendous increase in insect-borne infectious diseases of all types. We will see much more contamination of streams, rivers, and oceans. That comes with warming of the waters, which means there will be wide-scale losses of safe drinking water with epidemic waterborne infections such as cholera. We're already seeing that in parts of Asia. There will be oceanic toxic algae blooms. We see that already on freshwater lakes with massive fish die-off. And fish will no longer be an easy source of protein for people. We will have wide-scale crop failure and famine because of the predations of insects, drought, and weather extremes. We'll see a great increase in heat-related diseases like heat exhaustion, heat stroke, increased deaths of infants and the elderly and chronically ill who do not do well when temperatures are very high. If you look at death rates in general, they go way up when you have heat waves, and people simply can't survive that heat. When you have high ambient temperatures, there's an increased incidence of mental disease, suicide, societal aggression in general, and criminality. We're already seeing it. Massive hurricanes. We've seen larger hurricanes than have been seen in the last 100 years. And flooding on a huge scale. Huge forest fires. We've seen it all already. It's here. Massive loss of wildlife and precious diversity of living species being lost forever. And worst of all, rising oceans with inundation of thousands of seaside cities and massive losses of living space and cropland. It's already happening. The oceans are clearly rising. They've been rising continuously for the last 30 years. And the projection is it's going to take off like a stone about 2050. It's going to really go. This map shows the impact of oceans rising. Florida is not going to be a nice place to visit in another 50 years if we don't do something. And this may not look like a loss of land. This is a huge loss of living space because most of these areas, there's large numbers of people who live on the ocean. So how do we prepare for emerging diseases at all levels? Well, really, the biggest impetus to prepare was only very, very recently, and it was precipitated by one event. 9/11 was one of the tragic days in our nation's history, where 3,500 people were killed in an instant by terrorists who flew planes into the trade towers. That was followed within days by somebody sending weaponized anthrax to the mails, which created chaos on the East Coast. These two events had a profound impact on our federal government. We'd been sleeping. We realized we had no preparation for terrorism, for bioterrorism, for emerging infectious diseases. And this is a famous British aphorism. It's an ill wind that blows no good. That means the most devastating event might have an upside. And 9/11 did have an upside. It made us realize how vulnerable we were. And over the next 5 years, the federal government appropriated more money to public health departments across the country than they had in the last 20 years. And there was a tremendous injection of resources and personnel, and our public health system became much better. Controlling emerging infectious diseases is controlling all infectious diseases. Terrorism preparedness, we had no way to deal with the 1918-like influenza epidemic in early 2001. Within several years, we had a huge national strategy, a plan that's been updated now. Our preparation for dealing with pandemic influenza, which is one of my interests, has increased enormously in the last 10 to 15 years. What will you do to avert the international catastrophe from inexorable, rapid global warming? Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions, if you're willing. Questions? Sure.
You inspire me to ask what you would recommend we do.
I think you should contact your legislators and tell them you're very concerned about global warming, that the evidence is overwhelming, it's related to human activity. 98% of all international scientists in this country believe that global warming is driven primarily by human activity. If we don't do something to greatly curtail the burning of fossil fuels and use sustainable energy sources, that's the first step. That is the very first step. And it's absolutely essential. And we've got less than 10 years to make a difference. If we do nothing for 10 years, it may well be too late to avert what's going to happen.
It sounds as though you are an advocate for the Green Deal, Representative Cortez.
Well, the Green Deal is absolutely. The Green Deal is basically something that I think scientists who study global warming have been advocating for over 15 years, that we've got to cut back on burning fossil fuels. It's that plain and simple. We have the technology to be able to generate the vast majority of our energy from sustainable sources. We have to make the commitment to do so. Will it be painful? Yes. It'll be painful for 4 or 5 years. We'll pay more taxes. But on the other hand, it'll be a very beneficial payoff. And it's got to occur on an international scale. Interestingly, many parts of the world are doing much more than we are. We have been wrapped up in politics. People, prominent congressmen, a president that doesn't believe that human activity is related to global warming is very disappointing. And we have to change this. We just can't keep going on. We have to become activists. And one thing that I've learned from talking with a lot of people who are in government, if a congressman gets 10 letters from their constituents about something, they're concerned, they look at it. They get 50 letters, they're very concerned. They're doing something. Most of the time they get 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 letters about an issue, and we need to really try to interact with the people who are our leaders who are making these decisions. We need to elect people who understand the problem. Yes?
What's the feeling about nuclear energy?
Good question. Nuclear energy. I'm a physicist in my whole life. I was an undergraduate physics major. I took a year off from medical school to get a master's degree in physics, and I worked for 4 months for the Atomic Energy Commission. And ironically, what my job was, I was writing computer programs to analyze the radioactive spectrum of underground nuclear testing, which we no longer do. So I have a fairly good understanding of nuclear energy. And I think we've made a big mistake to curtail the use of nuclear energy as an energy source. Many areas of the world, they are building reactors on a wide scale. The problem of being able to dispose of these materials is not insurmountable. It is doable, but nuclear energy is very, very clean energy. There's almost no cleaner energy. And I think it's a big mistake to be closing down reactors the way we're doing it. That's not what's happening in many other parts of the world. Yes?
Now, what does the word pandemic mean?
Pandemic means an epidemic on a global scale. Pandemic means it's a global problem.
Can't get away from it.
Yep, can't get away from it. That's exactly right.
Yes, that one here.
A question. One of the things I find stunning, though, is that I just read in a news report of a legislator, I don't remember where it was, and he was arguing that, oh, well, we don't need to vaccinate, we can just build more antibiotics. A true ignorance of the biology. I mean, there's so many, and I remember a few years ago when the legislatures in one coastal eastern state passed a law that said that about the tides. The tides are not going to reach, and I said to myself, you know, you can't pass a law that says the tides are not going to go so high. I mean, there are physical properties of the world and biological properties. There are some folks that just don't really.
Well, first of all, a legislature that believes that we don't need vaccines because we've got antibiotics. The worst vaccine preventable diseases that we have that are the best vaccines that are almost 100% effective if they're used on a wide scale, we have no antibiotics for. We don't have any antivirals for treating. If I get measles, pneumonia, I better be lucky because we don't have anything to give me to help me survive. We have no good drugs for treating mumps, or we've got, so the bottom line is, why would you want to use antivirals? Because once you have to treat a disease, you're often too late, and some people are more vulnerable. Even though you may recognize it early and treat it, they still die. They don't survive because of their unique genetic vulnerability. Our goal must always be to prevent disease. If we can prevent disease, we get far more bang for the investment in the healthcare dollar than trying to treat disease. And vaccines have been a better investment for prevention than anything that has ever come down the road. Vaccines have had a greater impact on human health than any single measure. In the year 2000, everybody was making lists of the great achievements of the last 100 years. The number one achievement in healthcare that surmounted cancer chemotherapy, ICUs, miracle surgery, transplantation, was vaccines. More people's lives have been saved by vaccines than any other single other healthcare measure.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
I just wonder, Dr. Maki, if you have produced this for WPT so that it can get out there a lot more often.
I'm willing to give this talk anywhere because I feel very passionate about this field.
It just seems like that would be really important to do because you're so well respected.
People need to be educated. Most people think things through well, and once they're presented with the facts, they'll make rational decisions. Our biggest problem is far too many people are oblivious to what's going on around them. They don't understand what's going on, so they don't worry about it, and they sort of roll with the tide. And we can't afford to roll with the tide on this subject. We've got to do something pretty darn soon. And we've known this has been a problem. We've known this for 25 years.
So is this getting into the high schools? Because they're going to be the ones living with it.
The word needs to get out at every single level.
So what's being done, do you know?
I don't think much is being done in schools, in elementary or high schools. I don't think much is done. There are courses kids can take in college, but there's really no mandatory education on global warming, which is what is really needed.
Yes, sure.
Because it's become such a political football, there'll be many who don't believe that it's human-induced who will oppose mandatory education, which I think is a big mistake.
Okay, I'd like to thank Dr. Maki for one more. Yeah, sure.
Now, would you restate for me what the word vaccine means? Would you restate for me what the word vaccine means?
Vaccine means we take products from a microorganism that causes human disease. We treat it so it will not make you sick, but it stimulates your immune system to develop resistance. That's what a vaccine is. And the progress that's been made in developing vaccines has been extraordinary in my lifetime. Most of the vaccines we have now have become available since I started medical school. They were not available when I grew up. All we had when I grew up was tetanus vaccine and a rabies vaccine. It was a very dangerous form of a vaccine, and a few other rare vaccines. Almost all the common vaccines we give children now have only been developed in the last 50 to 60 years.
Okay, well, we have one more question.
Vaccine for Lyme disease. That's a very good question. Lyme disease is quite ubiquitous in Wisconsin. And they actually developed a vaccine for Lyme disease. 2 different companies developed a vaccine. The vaccine worked. It was effective. It was very well studied and shown to be effective and shown to be safe. And these companies expected every farmer, every DNR employee, every hunter, every fisherman, anybody who likes to backpack, anybody who might be exposed to ticks would certainly want to take the Lyme vaccine. And rumors seeped out that the vaccine maybe could cause arthritis. And very few people took the vaccine. And as a consequence, there was so little interest in the vaccine in the medical community that after about 7 or 8 years, the companies abandoned distributing it. And you know how they recoup their investment? Everybody who has a dog gets their dog immunized against Lyme disease. I've tried to convince our veterinarian to give me the vaccine he gives the dog, but I could never convince him. So we had a human Lyme vaccine, but we blew it.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we need to conclude. And again, thank you very much for a great talk.